Hey there, today I want to rant a bit about the U.S. choice to expand NATO. A lot has happened over the past 30 years. The U.S. and Russia have both done a lot of terrible stuff. And a full accounting of who exactly is at fault for the disintegration of the U.S.-Russia relationship would take a much longer, much more produced video that I may take the time to make one day. But today I want to rant a bit about the initial question of whether or not the U.S. promised not to expand NATO east of Germany. And if that promise existed, whether or not we should have honored that promise. But first, here's a standard disclaimer. Please don't take this out of context, but I am 100% with Vladimir Putin on the description of U.S. malfeasance here, on the description of NATO expansion being the real problem. But I stopped that in February of 2022 when he decided to murder a whole bunch of people. He had very, very, very valid critiques and very, very valid grievances that everybody should have taken very seriously, but he's the one who decided to start a major war, a major shooting war. It's Vladimir Putin and it's Russia that made the final decision to bring back full state versus state World War I style war back to the European continent. They should be condemned for that. They should not be forgiven for that. But I think we do have to understand how this came about, why this happened. And I think especially now that the Ukrainian conflict seems to have boiled down to a pretty awful stalemate that we're likely to have for years to come, I think it's time to think a little bit more honestly and a little more openly about what actually happened here.
And let's get into the fact that after 1991, when Russia expected that it would be welcomed into the brotherly family of civilized nations, nothing like this happened. You tricked us. I don't mean you personally when I say you. Of course, I'm talking about the United States. The promise was that NATO would not expand eastward, but it happened 5 times. There were 5 waves of expansion. We tolerated all that. We were trying to persuade them. We were saying, please don't. We are as bourgeois now as you are. We are market economy and there's no communist party power. Let's negotiate.
One argument to deal with briefly, because it's going to show up like 50 times in the comments, is, well, everyone in Central Europe wanted to join NATO. And I get it. I totally agree. I'm not arguing that the United States tied anybody's hands. We didn't coerce anybody. We bribed a hell of a lot of people. Every NGO salary was a bribe. But the security interests of a few tens of millions of Central Europeans are very clear here and hard to argue against. But what did the United States get out of NATO expansion? What did the rest of the human beings in the world get out of it? The point of NATO was to destroy the Soviet Union, which Mikhail Gorbachev accomplished in the early 1990s. What did the U.S. or the rest of the world get other than the destruction of the relationship between the only 2 countries that can currently wipe out human civilization? We made that relationship dramatically worse, which is probably one of the worst things you can do for world survival. NATO expansion imposed extraordinary costs on the United States and infinite risk of nuclear war on the entire world. So a few tens of millions of Central Europeans could have backup in their next shooting war with Russia. A shooting war with Russia that I suspect would not have happened without NATO expansion. The main benefit the United States has gotten from NATO expansion has been a big fat excuse to continue to waste $1 trillion a year on expensive weapons systems of dubious utility. Who needs infrastructure or healthcare? When Putin talks about our broken promise not to expand, he's not just speaking up for aggrieved Russians.
He's speaking in the national interest of the United States as well. So is Putin right about that? Did we make such a promise? Well, the U.S. national security establishment has been pretty evasive about that. Every Russian leader, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin, has insisted that the promise was made. The standard line from Washington, D.C. was that it was a simple misunderstanding. The Soviets might have believed that they heard something like that, but the U.S. didn't mean any such thing. Well, as time has gone on and things have gotten declassified, the U.S. story is looking shakier. It's not quite a smoking gun, but this U.S. State Department document from February 1990 seems pretty persuasive. The Secretary made clear that the U.S. had supported the goal of unification for years, that we supported a unified Germany within NATO, but that we were prepared to ensure that NATO's military presence would not extend further eastward. But that we were prepared to ensure that NATO's military presence would not extend further eastward. Some diehards are still trying to claim that Secretary Baker was only talking about NATO presence within East Germany, not NATO presence in the former Soviet Union, hundreds of miles to the east, which just seems nuts to me on its face. It's the kind of thinking that would only make sense to the most perversely literal of lawyers. The East Germany excuse sounds pretty shaky, so the more common approach nowadays is to just say, ha ha, well, the Ruskies should have gotten it in writing, dumbasses. So what do I think of that approach? Well, not much.
But do you think the fact that there was never like a proper, written document to say NATO wouldn't expand, it's quite often just reference to this one conversation that it never was in writing, so it's not like there's a great big treaty that, America has destroyed. It just feels a bit like, well, if you didn't get it in writing, like, tough luck.
Oh, I have no sympathy for that. I think it gets back to my really fundamental, like, the United States is in charge. Like, I don't see Russia as our equal. I see Russia as as children, fundamentally. I keep using this. It's a terrible analogy. I should stop doing it. I apologize preemptively. But in my world, the way that I view the world, Rory, is the United States is the adult and the rest of the countries are the people that we're responsible for. They're our children. That's not because we're smarter. It's just because we're infinitely more powerful. The relationship between the United States and every other country in the world is the relationship of an adult to a child.
Or they've taken them hostage.
Yes, or something along those lines. We have all the weapons. We have all the power. Perhaps that's a better one. The hostage taker to the hostages. So when I see, as I've seen over and over from Ben Bradley to other people being like, well, you didn't get it in writing. Tough luck, suckers. I see that and it's disgusting to me. To me, it's like an adult, like smacking a child around and being like, stop hitting yourself. Stop hitting yourself. I find that like, we didn't get it in writing. I'm sorry. I'm getting heated. I find that like, you didn't get it in writing so we can lie to you, dumbasses. And keep in mind, this is Gorbachev. This is the guy who was like, actually, like, I know for the past 50 years, like, it's been written, it's been like one of the fundamental constants of the world that we're going to kill each other, that mutually assured destruction is going to happen.
Gorbachev is the guy who decided, hey, let's just not do that. Gorbachev is loathed by Russians, I know, because of what the United States did with his legacy.
Mikhail Gorbachev is one of the few heroes that history has to offer. I don't know if there's this great film made by Werner Herzog. Werner Herzog, the famous German director who's like this avatar of darkness and cruelty, and the world is a terrible, terrible place.
And nature here is vile and base. I wouldn't see anything erotical here. I would see fornication and asphyxiation and choking and fighting for survival and growing and just rotting away. The birds are in misery. I don't think they sing, they just screech in pain.
And there's this incredible film he made about Gorbachev just in the past 4 or 5 years where he just he goes and interviews Gorbachev and he's like a little kid because I meet a person who is actually a good person who made the world incredibly better.
When all of a sudden the reunification came in the fall of the Berlin Wall, I became very, very fond of Gorbachev because he allowed reunification without violence, without bloodshed.
It's very strange because you're like, Werner Herzog, like what's wrong with you, Werner? But apparently the two things that Werner Herzog likes in this world are Mikhail Gorbachev and Star Wars. Like this heroic figure who was trying and failing to keep his world together. And he said, look, you know what? Like, we're not going to make a big deal about you reunifying Germany, about righting this great historical wrong. If I just get this commitment from these guys I trust, from George W. Bush and James Baker, that NATO's not going to expand one more inch, right? And they're like, yeah. No, you don't need it in writing. It'll be fine. There's this widespread meme that Russians are some kind of long-standing immortal evil that was just naturally going to wreck everything, so we had to expand NATO, the organization dedicated to Russia's destruction. Well, that's just ahistorical bullshit. First off, any Russian history before 1945 is meaningless because everybody else was doing things that were just as bad, if not worse. And Russia has Gorbachev, whether or not they want him. Probably the only politician in the world, certainly the only one in charge of a great power, that qualifies as something of a saint. Putin is obviously not a nice guy, but I'm 45 years old. I remember all of Putin's time in power as an adult, and he spent almost the entire time kissing our asses, helping us in Afghanistan, trying to save us from our calamitous fuck-up in Iraq, trying to join in on our war on terror, trying to work with us in Libya. And we just kept pissing in his face.
We were trying to persuade them. We were saying, please don't. We are as bourgeois now as you are. We are a market economy and there's no communist party power. Let's negotiate.
NATO's not going to expand one more inch, right? And they're like, yeah. No, you don't need it in writing. It'll be fine. And this idea that it's okay for the U.S. government to be like, ha, ha, fuck you. It is, you didn't get it in writing. It enrages me, frankly. And that is the point. This like, Lockheed Martin wants us to keep expanding NATO. My understanding, that's more or less how it happened. Every U.S. foreign policy grande from Henry Kissinger to George Kennan, et cetera, was like, please don't do this. But Lockheed Martin wanted it, and they put a bunch of money into it, so NATO expanded. And now they're selling F-35s to everybody. They got exactly what they wanted. It's just incredibly sinister, and it's the reason why we have a war in Ukraine right now. So yes, perhaps that's a very long way of explaining that. No, I don't think it's a good argument.
But what does all this really matter, Rob, you may be asking, when we consider just how bad Russia's crimes are? Well, certainly, Vladimir Putin, the Russian state in general, have committed terrible, terrible crimes, but I just don't think people fully grasp how insignificant Russia truly is and how much its decisions, however awful they may be, are influenced by the United States. I came up with another analogy beyond the sort of teacher, student, or hostage analogy I was using earlier. Comparing Russia to the United States is like comparing a basketball to a basketball court. Thanks for listening. I'll try to be more produced next week, but I'm trying to get back to weekly production, and this is what I had to throw out there. I hope you didn't find it too disturbing. Thanks.